In the spring of 1977, a young woman vanished on her short walk home from the library in a quiet American town. 2 weeks later, her body was found in an abandoned shed. Beside her, just one clue: a silver cufflink engraved with the letter H. For decades, no one could solve her murder. But when modern science reopened the case, investigators uncovered a horrifying truth about two reclusive brothers, and a secret darker than any small-town legend could imagine. Spring in Maplewood, Washington, always carried a damp heaviness, but 1977 seemed different. That April, rain came almost every day, soaking into the soil, dripping steadily from the eaves of old houses, and settling into people's bones. The sky was a low ceiling of gray, pressing down on the rooftops of a town that had never been remarkable for anything beyond its quiet charm. Maplewood wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. Families left their doors unlocked, kids rode their bikes down Main Street without worry, and neighbors waved to each other as though they were all part of the same extended family. Safety felt like part of the landscape. And then, in one ordinary week of that ordinary spring, the illusion of safety cracked. On Friday, April 22nd, 22-year-old Sarah Whitmore finished her shift at the children's section of the town library. She had been shelving picture books, helping first graders stumble through early readers, and planning the next Saturday story hour. Sarah had always been described as gentle, quick to laugh, and endlessly patient with children. She had recently graduated from a small teacher's college and was hoping for a classroom job by fall. In the meantime, the library job gave her a paycheck, a sense of purpose, and the joy of being surrounded by books. Sarah wasn't a stranger in Maplewood, far from it. Everyone knew her as Sally, the girl with the wheat blonde hair, freckles across her nose, and a kind of natural openness that made even strangers feel like friends. She was the youngest daughter of June and Thomas Whitmore, who lived in a modest clapboard house a few blocks from the library. For them, she was the light that made their small-town life feel full of possibility. At 6:45 that evening, before heading home, Sarah stepped into the glass-paneled phone booth outside the library. She dialed her mother to say she would stop at Lang's Market on Main Street. Just milk, bread, and peaches, she said, and that she would be home by 7. It was the kind of casual update daughters gave mothers in towns where nothing ever went wrong. Lang's Market was a narrow little store, the kind with squeaky linoleum floors and a bell above the door. A clerk later remembered Sarah walking in, picking up a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a tin of canned peaches. She paid in cash, smiled politely, and disappeared back into the drizzle. The grocery bag she carried would be the last confirmed trace of her. By 10 o'clock, when Sarah still hadn't returned, her mother began pacing the kitchen, glancing again and again at the clock above the stove. Thomas Whitmore, trying to mask his worry, started calling Sarah's friends, then neighbors, then her former college roommate. No one had seen her since the library. By 11:30, the pretense of calm collapsed. Thomas dialed the sheriff's office from the rotary phone in their living room. Sheriff Daniel Mercer, a stocky man with a mustache thick enough to belong in a 1970s cop show, took the report. But he repeated the line that countless desperate families across America would come to despise. Official missing person investigations required a 24-hour waiting period. That night, June barely slept. She kept Sarah's bedroom light on, as if the warm glow might guide her daughter home. Thomas sat in his chair with a notebook, jotting down the names of everyone he had called, trying to find order in a situation that refused order. The next morning, Maplewood woke to the kind of gossip that spreads faster than any weather. A man walking his dog near the back lot of Lang's Market spotted a brown grocery bag tucked against a chain-link fence. Inside were the groceries Sarah had bought, still wrapped, untouched. The bag looked as if it had been set down, not dropped, but Sarah was nowhere in sight. With that discovery, the case shifted from maybe she lost track of time to something far darker. Sheriff Mercer arrived with his deputies, cordoned off the area with yellow tape, and began the slow, methodical process of crime scene investigation as it existed in the 1970s. A deputy photographed the bag with a Polaroid camera. Another dusted the paper handles for fingerprints with a gray powder that left smudges more than clarity. There were no computers to run prints, no digital files. Every mark had to be cataloged by hand, compared card by card against the few records they had on file. The news spread quickly. By the afternoon, the townspeople themselves had organized search parties. Men pulled on denim jackets and boots, women tied scarves under their chins against the drizzle, and teenagers volunteered to staple flyers with Sarah's face onto telephone poles. Her graduation photo, smiling and bright, stared down from every corner of Main Street. Missing, Sarah Whitmore, 22. Last seen April 22nd. Blonde hair, green eyes. The typewritten letters looked painfully ordinary, but the meaning behind them was not. For the first time in decades, Maplewood felt unsafe. Neighbors locked their doors at night. Parents forbade their children from walking alone. People spoke in hushed tones in diners and hardware stores, as if saying too much aloud might make the horror more real. And in the Whitmore house, June and Thomas prayed that their daughter would walk through the front door, groceries in hand, smiling at how worried everyone had been. She never did. 17 days after Sarah Whitmore vanished, Maplewood learned the answer it had been dreading. On the afternoon of May 9, 1977, a farmer named Henry Lowe was walking the far edge of his property, an abandoned stretch of land with sagging fences and a weather-beaten shed he hadn't used in years. What caught his attention wasn't the building itself but the crows circling above it, dozens of them swooping and crying in a frenzy. It was the kind of sight that farmers instinctively understood. Crows meant something dead. Inside the shed, in the heavy stillness of damp wood and dust, Henry saw what would unravel Maplewood's innocence forever. The body of a young woman lay crumpled on the floor, clothing disheveled, skin pale against the dark boards. He didn't need to look twice to know it was Sarah. Sheriff Mercer arrived minutes later. He stepped inside, removed his hat, and stood in silence for a long moment before ordering the scene sealed. Deputies hammered yellow tape across the door frame, and a county photographer, fumbling with his Nikon film camera, snapped a series of harsh, grainy images. The medical examiner worked with the limited tools of the time, thermometers, observation, rudimentary lab tests. But the conclusion was clear. Sarah had been dead since the night she disappeared. Cause of death: asphyxiation, likely by strangulation. Her wrists and ankles bore raw marks, abrasions that suggested she had been tied. There were signs of sexual assault. For a town already on edge, the confirmation was devastating. Rumors spread faster than facts. That she had been stalked, that she had been taken by a stranger, that someone in Maplewood knew more than they were admitting. Fear turned neighbors into suspects in the eyes of one another. The sheriff's office gathered what little evidence they could. Sarah's purse was missing, but in the dirt near her body they found something curious. A single silver cufflink, slightly tarnished, engraved with an ornate letter H. Whether it had been dropped accidentally or torn loose in a struggle, no one could say. But in a case with almost no leads, it became the most important clue. Investigators turned to the people closest to Sarah. First was her former boyfriend, Tim Brennan, a local schoolteacher with whom she had broken up 3 months earlier. He was brought into the sheriff's office, seated at a metal table beneath a buzzing fluorescent light, and questioned for hours while Mercer tapped his pen and asked the same questions in slightly different ways. Brennan insisted he had been at a rock concert the night Sarah vanished. Witnesses confirmed it, and even the torn stub of his ticket supported the alibi. Next came Leon Ramos, a young assistant librarian who had once been seen walking Sarah to her car after late shifts. Quiet, nervous, chain-smoking through the interrogation, he swore he had nothing to do with her disappearance. His alibi, dinner with his visiting sister and mother, checked out as well. The town whispered names, pointing fingers at the drifter who drank at the corner bar, at the gas station attendant who smiled too wide, at anyone who didn't fit the narrow mold of normal. But nothing concrete emerged. Each suspect dissolved under scrutiny, leaving only the cufflink as the solitary anchor in a sea of speculation. For the Whitmores, grief became ritual. June stopped attending church potlucks and spent hours sitting in Sarah's room, staring at the bedspread her daughter had picked out in high school. Thomas grew restless, pacing the house at night, keeping a worn notebook filled with lists of names, theories, questions he meant to ask the sheriff. Every time he called the station, the answer was the same: "We're still working on it." By August 1977, after weeks of combing woods, questioning neighbors, and comparing fingerprints by hand, Sheriff Mercer admitted what no one wanted to hear. The case had gone cold. The Whitmore file, thick with handwritten notes and grainy photographs, was boxed up and stored in the basement of the sheriff's office, alongside dozens of other unresolved crimes. The official line was procedural. Resources had to shift to new cases, and there were no fresh leads. But to the Whitmores, and to many in Maplewood, it felt like abandonment. The town returned to its routines. Kids went back to school. Shopkeepers reopened with smiles. Rain continued to fall, but nothing was the same. There was a hole where Sarah had been, and a silence that no one could fill. The cufflink, small and gleaming, sat in an evidence envelope, waiting for a future that no one yet imagined. When a case goes cold, time becomes both an enemy and a disguise. In Maplewood, Sarah Whitmore's murder didn't vanish. It hung in the air, unspoken but heavy, like humidity before a storm. By the early 1980s, the town had learned how to carry it, how to glance past the old flyers still stapled to telephone poles, how to avoid the hollow ache of seeing Sarah's photograph in the newspaper archives. For June and Thomas Whitmore, there was no moving past. June stopped volunteering at church and withdrew from the potlucks where casseroles once carried her name on masking tape. She spent long hours in Sarah's bedroom, folding and refolding sweaters that would never again be worn, touching the spines of the books her daughter had loved as a child. Visitors sometimes found her sitting on the bed with an open photo album, staring at the images until her eyes watered. Thomas, on the other hand, turned restless. He carried a worn spiral notebook everywhere, filling it with names, rumors, and half-formed theories. He called the sheriff's office so often that deputies began recognizing his voice before he spoke. "Any updates?" he would ask, and Sheriff Mercer would sigh and tell him there was nothing new. The notebook became his obsession. Some nights he left the house to drive past Lang's Market, as if retracing Sarah's last steps might reveal something everyone else had missed. The town itself, meanwhile, tried to heal through avoidance. New shops opened on Main Street. The old grocery was replaced by a chain supermarket, its sterile aisles erasing the memory of Sarah's final errand. The library where she'd once worked moved to a brick building with a computer lab, the children's section filled with bright plastic chairs and early Apple posters. The city council built a new park and named it for a local war veteran, not for the librarian whose death had once shaken the town. By the mid-1980s, the Whitmore's tragedy was overshadowed by other headlines. Reagan's election, Lennon's assassination, the explosion of pop culture that seemed to light up every living room. In Maplewood, teenagers who hadn't been born in 1977 grew up hearing about Sarah's murder the way children hear about haunted houses. Whispered, half-believed, a story to frighten one another at sleepovers. The old shed where her body had been found became a dare. Braver kids would sneak inside, daring each other to touch the splintered walls. But for June, the wound never scabbed over. Every April 22nd, she lit candles at St. Mary's Church, standing in silence while the few remaining townsfolk joined her in prayer. Some years there were dozens in attendance. By the late 80s, only a handful. She gave interviews to the Maplewood Chronicle, the small-town paper that tucked her words between ads for hardware sales and notices of high school basketball games. "We haven't lost hope," she would say, her voice thin but steady. "Justice is slow, but it's coming." In 1985, grief finally caught Thomas. He collapsed at the kitchen table one evening, clutching his chest, and never stood again. At his funeral, June placed a photograph of Sarah in his hands and whispered, "Now you'll be together." Neighbors remembered the way she pressed her lips to the coffin before it was lowered, as though sealing a promise she could not keep in life. After his death, June's world narrowed even further. She rarely left the house, except for anniversaries at the church. She wrote yearly letters to the sheriff's office, carefully penned in blue ink, asking if Sarah's case had been reviewed, if the cufflink had been examined again. The letters went into filing cabinets, sometimes answered, often ignored. By the early 1990s, Maplewood was a different place. Big box stores opened on the highway, drawing business away from downtown. Payphones disappeared, replaced by pagers and the first bulky cell phones. Kids no longer whispered about Sarah Whitmore. They barely knew her name. But to June, time had not dulled the memory. She kept a framed photograph of Sarah on her bedside table, speaking to it in the evenings as if her daughter might still answer. In 1994, nearly 2 decades after Sarah's disappearance, June passed away quietly in her sleep. At her funeral, neighbors placed flowers on the small plot where Thomas already lay. Beside him stood a symbolic marker for Sarah, a headstone without a body, etched with the words, "Beloved daughter." Her smile lit our lives. For many, that seemed like the final chapter. Another cold case buried not just in evidence boxes but in the lives of those who had cared most. Yet the cufflink still waited in its envelope, untouched, as if biding its time for a future when science might finally be able to hear what the past had been whispering all along. By the early 1990s, Maplewood had become a town that wore its tragedies like faded scars, visible if you knew where to look, but rarely spoken of aloud. The Whitmore case was no longer front-page news, no longer the subject of every diner conversation. It had become a whisper, something passed down like a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the abandoned shed where Sarah's body had been found. They told ghost stories about her wandering spirit, still clutching the grocery bag she never brought home. For them, Sarah was less a real woman and more a legend, the librarian who vanished, the face on a faded flyer yellowing in the school's archive cabinet. But for those who remembered her, the wound had not healed. Each April 22nd, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the small church on Pine Street held a memorial service. In the early years, dozens came, classmates, neighbors, co-workers from the library. Over time, the crowd thinned. By the late 1980s, only the closest family and a handful of loyal townsfolk remained. The services were quiet affairs. Candles flickered against stained glass, hymns echoed softly, and June Whitmore's voice, thin but steady, rose each year to say the same words: "We will not give up on Sarah. Justice is still possible." After June's death in 1994, the services continued in smaller, more fragile ways. Sarah's surviving relatives kept the tradition alive, though the pews grew emptier. Local newspapers gave it a paragraph, tucked between grocery ads and high school sports scores. Yet the act of remembering mattered. It was a refusal to let Sarah become only a story whispered at slumber parties. Outside the family, though, Maplewood moved on. The town got a strip mall and a new highway exit. Lang's Market closed, replaced by a national supermarket with bright lights and uniformed clerks. The old payphone where Sarah had called her mother was torn down, leaving nothing but a patch of cracked concrete. Even the library where she had once read to children relocated to a modern brick building with rows of computers. To newcomers, Sarah's story was something they heard about only in fragments, mentioned by longtime residents when the rain set in, or recalled when someone noticed the overgrown shed outside town. That's where they found her, people would say almost casually, as if pointing out a landmark. The Harlan brothers remained on their farm, silent figures glimpsed at the feed store or driving an old pickup through town. Without Marianne, their lives became even more insular. They planted crops, kept a few cows, and rarely spoke to anyone. For most residents, they blended into the backdrop of Maplewood life, as unremarkable as the fields themselves. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. A few older townsfolk would lower their voices and wonder if Sarah's killer had been among them all along. Others pushed the thought away, preferring the comfort of time and distance. By the end of the decade, Sarah Whitmore was no longer a daily ache for most of Maplewood. She had become something else, a story that defined the town in ways it didn't want to admit. For the Whitmore family, it was grief without closure. For the rest of the town, it was folklore. A reminder that even in the quietest places, shadows can stretch farther than anyone dares to imagine. And all the while, in a sealed envelope in the sheriff's basement, the silver cufflink with its engraved H waited, an artifact of a truth that no one yet understood, a whisper from the past asking not to be forgotten. For more than 40 years, the Whitmore file sat in the basement of the Maplewood Sheriff's Office. Cardboard boxes gathered dust, photographs curled at the edges, and handwritten notes faded to the color of weak tea. The silver cufflink, sealed in an evidence envelope, was moved from shelf to shelf but never touched. It was as though the case itself had been waiting for the world to catch up. In March 2020, the world did. When Sheriff Maya Jensen took office, she came with a mission. A former homicide detective from Spokane, Jensen had seen firsthand how advances in forensic science could revive cases everyone thought were unsolvable. She believed in second chances not just for people but for justice. Within weeks of her swearing-in, she launched the Cold Case Review Project, assigning detectives to pull old files from storage and re-examine them with modern tools. The Whitmore file was among the first. Detectives unsealed the evidence boxes, laying out yellowed photographs, brittle reports, and bags marked with the sheriff's handwriting from 1977. The cufflink still gleamed faintly, its silver surface dulled by time but intact. Modern technology transformed the old evidence. Photographs taken with film cameras were scanned at high resolution and digitally enhanced, revealing details no one in the 70s could have seen. Smudges, fibers, faint impressions. The cufflink was examined under a forensic microscope, where investigators noticed something they had missed for decades. Beneath a layer of grime on the inside surface was a faint engraving. Not just the ornate H seen before, but a fuller word. After careful cleaning, the name came into focus: Harlan. It was the first solid lead the case had seen in more than 4 decades. Detectives turned next to the biological evidence. In 1977, swabs and samples collected from Sarah's body had been stored, though the technology to analyze them didn't exist at the time. Miraculously, enough material had survived. Using modern DNA extraction methods, a full genetic profile was created and uploaded into CODIS, the national database. There was no direct match. But there was something else: partial connections, the kind that hinted at relatives. One name in particular stood out: a younger man with the last name Harlan, arrested for DUI in 2015, whose DNA had entered the system. The profile didn't match Sarah's killer exactly, but it was close enough to suggest family. The investigation suddenly had momentum. Detective Mike Rodriguez, assigned to lead the review, began piecing together the Harlan family tree. He was stunned to learn that Robert and Edward Harlan were still alive, still living on the same farm outside Maplewood, now in their 70s. They had never left, never sold the land, never broken their routines. To test the connection, detectives began surveillance. They collected discarded items, cigarette butts, water bottles, tissues, from the brothers' trash. DNA extracted from these items showed partial matches to the profile recovered from Sarah Whitmore's body. It was enough to confirm a disturbing truth. The killer had come from inside the Harlan bloodline. But there was a complication. The DNA didn't point cleanly to one man or the other. It overlapped, tangled, suggested something strange. Experts reviewed the results and raised a rare possibility: genetic chimerism, a condition in which twins share mixed DNA from a third, vanished sibling. The revelation meant one thing: after decades of silence, the Whitmore case had not only reopened, it had become one of the most unusual forensic puzzles in American history. And Maplewood, once again, would be forced to look at its quiet fields and barns with new eyes. On a gray October morning in 2020, deputies and forensic teams rolled down the dirt road leading to the Harlan farm. Their convoy of white vans and marked cruisers startled the neighbors, few as they were, who hadn't seen such activity on the outskirts of Maplewood in decades. Armed with a search warrant, Sheriff Jensen's team was ready to uncover what the old farmhouse might still be hiding. Robert and Edward Harlan didn't resist. By then they were 74 years old, their faces drawn, their bodies slowed by arthritis and time. They watched silently from the porch as officers in white Tyvek suits and blue gloves combed through the house, barn, and outbuildings. There was no protest, no shouting. Just 2 men who seemed almost detached, as if they had known this day would eventually come. Inside the farmhouse, the search began methodically. Every drawer, every trunk, Every closet was photographed and catalogued. The walls smelled of dust and mildew, the air thick with years of neglect. In the living room, officers found stacks of old newspapers, some dating back to the 1970s, carefully bundled with twine. In the attic, they discovered boxes of women's clothing that clearly hadn't belonged to either brother. Dresses, scarves, jewelry. The most chilling discovery came from the barn. Beneath a warped wooden floorboard in a side shed, officers uncovered a narrow trapdoor. When they pried it open, a hidden crawlspace revealed itself. Inside were boxes sealed with duct tape. Forensic specialists lifted them out, placed them on tarps, and opened them one by one. Inside the first box was Sarah Whitmore's library badge, still laminated, her smiling face looking as fresh as the day it was issued. The second box contained her diary, its cover decorated with faded 70s flowers. More boxes held photographs, candid shots of Sarah walking down Maplewood streets, browsing in the market, sitting on a park bench. She had been followed, watched, catalogued, but the discoveries didn't stop there. Among the evidence were personal belongings of another woman. Dresses, letters, jewelry that belonged to Marian Harlan, Robert's wife who had supposedly died in an accident in 1987. Tucked inside her belongings was a diary of her own. The final entry, dated the day before her death, was a desperate note of fear. She wrote of being trapped in a nightmare, of brothers who shared her like property, of threats that if she ever tried to leave, she wouldn't live to tell the story. Then came the discovery that froze even seasoned officers. In the basement of the farmhouse, behind a locked door, they found a room carefully arranged like a shrine. In the center sat a rocking chair, and in that chair, wearing a yellowed wedding dress, was the mummified body of Marian Harlan. Fresh flowers lay in a vase beside her. An unfinished breakfast rested on a tray. It was as though the brothers had been living with her ghost for more than 30 years, keeping her present in a grotesque mockery of life. For detectives, the evidence was overwhelming. The Harlan farm wasn't just a place of isolation. It was a tomb, a museum of secrets where victims' lives had been collected, preserved, and displayed. Each object told a story of control, obsession, and violence. As forensic trucks hauled boxes of evidence away, Maplewood gathered in stunned silence. The whispers that had haunted the town for decades were no longer folklore. They were fact. And the silver cufflink that had sat untouched in an envelope since 1977 had finally led investigators to the darkest truth the town had ever faced. By the spring of 2021, the case of Sarah Whitmore and Marian Harlan had become national news. Maplewood, a town few outside Washington had ever heard of, was suddenly on every front page. Satellite trucks lined Main Street, reporters crowded the diner for coffee, and camera crews swarmed the courthouse. For locals, it felt surreal. Their quiet town, now the stage for a true crime story that shocked the country. Robert and Edward Harlan were led into court in wheelchairs, their wrists in shackles, their faces blank. Decades of age had weathered them, but their presence still carried a chill. They were charged with the first-degree murders of Sarah Whitmore and Marian Harlan, alongside counts of sexual assault, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. The prosecution opened with force. They laid out the timeline. Sarah's disappearance in 1977, the discovery of her body in the shed, the cufflink engraved with Harlan. Then they presented the breakthroughs of 2020 DNA analysis, genetic evidence pointing to the brothers, and the cache of belongings hidden on the farm. Photographs of Sarah's diary, her badge, and the shrine-like basement room were projected for the jury. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Most damning of all were Marianne's diaries. In trembling handwriting, she had described years of captivity, threats, and violence. The final entry, written hours before her death, was read aloud. "I don't think I'll survive this. If anyone finds this, please know I tried to escape." Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats as her words filled the room. The defense tried to counter with doubts. They argued the evidence was too old, the DNA contaminated after decades in storage. They suggested the cufflink could have been planted, that Marianne's death had been truly accidental, and that the brothers, confused and frail, were being made scapegoats for unsolved mysteries. But experts dismantled those arguments one by one. Forensic scientists explained the preservation methods, the genetic chimerism that made the case unusual but still clear. FBI specialists testified about how modern techniques ruled out contamination. Detectives described the hidden room, the flowers, the breakfast tray, the mummified body that could not be explained away as accident or chance. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witnesses included Sarah's surviving relatives, who spoke through tears about decades without answers. Marianne's son, now middle-aged, testified about the fear he'd lived with as a child on the farm. The whispered fights, the locked doors, the nights he lay awake wishing for escape. His words brought many in the courtroom to tears. When closing arguments ended, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. On May 14, 2021, they filed back into the courtroom. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The judge, his voice steady but firm, sentenced Robert and Edward Harlan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The brothers showed no reaction, no apology, no anger, no visible acknowledgement of the lives they had destroyed. For the first time in their lives, they were separated, sent to different correctional facilities, left to age and die apart. In the gallery, Sarah's niece, born years after her death, clutched her mother's hand as the verdict was read. For her family, the words guilty carried a bittersweet weight. Justice had come, but decades too late for Sarah's parents, who had gone to their graves without answers. Outside the courthouse, Sheriff Jensen spoke to the press. "This case proves one thing," she said. "Time does not erase truth. It only waits for us to find the tools to uncover it." In the months following the verdict, Maplewood tried to settle back into its quiet rhythm. But nothing was quite the same. The trial had ripped open decades of silence, forcing the town to confront the truth hiding in plain sight. What had once been whispers was now history, written into court transcripts and national headlines. For Sarah's family, there was finally something like closure. After 44 years, her remains, long kept in evidence storage, were released for burial. On a cool September morning, relatives and townspeople gathered at St. Mary's Cemetery. A modest headstone was placed beside her parents, engraved with the words, "Beloved daughter, teacher in spirit." The ceremony was small, but as the coffin was lowered, many in attendance wept openly. It wasn't just grief. It was relief that Sarah could finally rest. Marian Harlan, too, was reburied. Her son, now living under a new name in another state, returned to Maplewood for the service. He spoke softly to reporters afterward, saying he planned to establish a foundation in her memory, one dedicated to helping survivors of domestic abuse. "My mother's voice was silenced," he said, "but maybe her story can still protect others." The town itself chose not to bury the past but to mark it. The county seized the Harlan farm, and within a year the rotting buildings were torn down. In their place, the city council approved the creation of a memorial park. At its center stood a bronze sculpture of an open book, dedicated to Sarah's love of reading. Nearby, a plaque bore a quote from one of her favorite poems, "Stories live as long as we tell them." A second marker honored Marianne, with the words, "She deserved freedom, and so do all who suffer in silence." The Maplewood Public Library also honored Sarah's memory by creating the Whitmore Children's Collection. Each spring, they hosted a Sarah Whitmore Reading Day, inviting teachers, authors, and children to gather for story hours. For the younger generation, many of whom hadn't even been born when Sarah disappeared, it became a way to connect with her life rather than her death. Beyond Maplewood, the case sparked wider conversations. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, books were written, and documentaries aired on national television. But in professional circles, the Whitmore case became a milestone in forensic science. Journals published articles on how DNA and genetic genealogy had cracked a crime once thought unsolvable. The strange twist of chimerism was studied in universities as an example of science catching up to mystery. For Sheriff Jensen and her team, the victory brought more than closure. Their cold case review project received additional funding, expanding into other unsolved crimes from the 1970s and 1980s. Within 2 years, Several more cases were reopened, giving hope to families who had nearly given up. Justice has no expiration date, Jensen told a press conference. Every file in those boxes represents someone who mattered. For Maplewood, memory became both burden and strength. Every April, candles still flickered in the church where June once prayed alone. But now more people joined. They came not just to mourn, but to affirm that forgetting was not an option. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer hidden. Sarah and Marianne were no longer whispers in the dark. They were names carved into stone, memorials in parks, lessons in classrooms, and reminders that even the smallest piece of evidence, a silver cufflink, could one day shine a light bright enough to pierce decades of darkness. Every case leaves an afterimage, a shadow that lingers long after verdicts are read and sentences are carried out. For Maplewood, the Whitmore case became that shadow, a reminder that evil had lived quietly among them, disguised as ordinary men on an ordinary farm. Detective Mike Rodriguez, who had led the Modern Review, often spoke about the case as the defining moment of his career. "It taught me patience," he said in an interview years later. "Evidence doesn't go away, it waits. Sometimes all it takes is a single overlooked detail, and suddenly the past speaks." Each April, he still brought flowers to Sarah's grave, standing silently as rain tapped against the cemetery stones. Robert Harlan died in prison in 2023, pneumonia finally claiming what decades of justice could not. Edward survived him by 6 months. On his deathbed, he allegedly confessed to a prison chaplain that he had been the one to strangle Sarah. But whether it was truth, manipulation, or a confused attempt to control the narrative one last time, no one could be certain. Even in death, the brothers kept their secrets. Marianne's son fulfilled his promise. He established the Marian Foundation, which funded shelters and counseling services for survivors of abuse across Washington state. "My family history is a nightmare," he said at the foundation's opening. "But nightmares end when you turn on the light. My mother didn't get that chance, but others will." 5 years after the trial, Maplewood opened a small museum of forensic history. The Whitmore exhibit featured photographs, a timeline of the investigation, and displays comparing the crude fingerprint powders of the 1970s to the DNA sequencing machines of today. At the center of the exhibit sat a glass case containing 2 objects: Sarah's graduation photograph and the silver cufflink engraved with the name Harlan. Visitors often lingered in front of it, whispering about how something so small, so ordinary, had cracked open one of the darkest chapters in the town's history. Every spring, the Maplewood Book Festival dedicated its opening day to Sarah Whitmore. Children gathered on blankets while teachers and librarians read aloud from her favorite stories. Parents told newcomers about the young woman who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, and whose life was stolen before she had the chance. "Stories live as long as we tell them," the bronze plaque in the park read, and Maplewood kept telling hers. For the older residents, the lesson was harsher. They remembered seeing the Harlan brothers in search parties, carrying lanterns, offering sympathy, all while hiding their crimes. It left them with an unsettling truth. Monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they sit quietly in church pews, nod politely at the grocery store, or live on the farm down the road. And yet, alongside that fear came a different truth, that justice, though delayed, is still possible. Technology, persistence, and the refusal of families to forget can drag secrets into the light. When the sun sets behind Maplewood's hills, casting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, locals sometimes say it feels like Sarah's colors. Her niece, grown now, once said in a speech, "My grandparents never saw justice, but I believe they know. Somewhere they know." In the sheriff's office lobby, a small glass cabinet displays the cufflink and Sarah's photograph side by side. The caption reads simply, "Even the smallest clue can change everything." Visitors stop, look, and fall silent, because the story of Sarah Whitmore is no longer just tragedy. It is a testament to memory, resilience, and the truth that refuses to stay buried.